Good morning. Welcome to our Fiscal Basics 2-day training. My name is Agustin Garcia, and on behalf of our project director, Adrian Balcazar, we want to thank you for joining us for part 2 this morning. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce the LCAP State and Federal Programs team. Joining us this morning, we have Debbie Cano, Helen Choi, Laurel Estrada, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, and Anita Lomeli. We also have our administrative assistant, April Grease, and Arthur Gutierrez. To access today's presentation, simply click on the link provided in the chat. This will take you to our Canvas page where you can access the presentation through the icon shown here. The agenda and additional resources are also available on the page for your convenience. We're recording today's workshop, and the recording link will be posted there as well. Once the Q&A is complete, you'll find that posted on the page too. In addition to our presentation, we have additional resources to support your work with the fiscal oversight of your federal programs. We have 2 resources available for purchase, and they are the Fiscal Fundamentals Guide and Time and Effort Reporting. Both resources have been updated and are currently in the printing phase of our publication process. You can find the ordering information at the link on the bottom of the slide. So today, we'll focus on time and effort reporting, maintenance of effort, supplement not supplant, Title I Part A comparability, equipment inventory, and we'll close with federal program monitoring. We'd love to hear your questions, so please feel free to share them in the chat, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can during our session. For any unanswered questions, we'll follow up with a written Q&A, which will be emailed to all registered participants, and like I mentioned, posted on our Canvas page. And these are some of the documents we referenced last week and we'll reference again today. ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, is the current authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that forms the legal basis for most federal programs. This is the statute. The Uniform Grants Guidance is another name for the Code of Federal Regulations, which includes requirements for all federal education programs. The CSAM is a California School Accounting Manual, which is the state's guidance for fiscal accounting and determinations. And the EDGAR is the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. This handbook is based on the Uniform Grants Guidance and provides additional requirements and clarifications for programs operated by the Department of Education. One additional reference we want to share is the CDE's Federal Grants Fiscal Guidance. The CDE Federal Grants Fiscal Guidance contains information on developing policies and procedures and federal and state program and administrative requirements. Other topics here include allowability, time and effort, cash management, supplement not supplant, procurement, and inventory and property management. In addition, you'll find answers to frequently asked fiscal and programmatic questions in this document. You can download this from the CDE Federal Fiscal Guidance webpage. Once again, welcome to part 2 of our Fiscal Basics training. So now I'll turn it over to Helen and Anita, who will go over time and effort reporting.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. In this section, we will cover time and effort reporting and provide you with information to enhance your understanding of time and effort reporting and time accounting. So, what triggers time and effort reporting and time accounting? Federal regulations require time and effort documentation in addition to time cards that you might have for all personnel who receive any payments or compensation from federal funds. In addition, restricted state programs such as expanded learning will require time and effort documentation. The documentation will depend and will vary depending on the funding source in terms of whether it's Title I, II, III, or IV, as well as the nature of the job duties. Payroll time reporting must also reflect the actual hours that were worked on each program as indicated and should be aligned to the time and effort certification documents. So again, there must be alignment between compensation and the documentation that memorializes what has been done. This must be done no matter how much federal funding is included in their salary, whether it's a penny or it's funded at 100%. And that's what triggers time and effort reporting. So let's take a closer look at the part of the Code of Federal Regulations. Remember from our day 1 of our workshop that all costs must be necessary, reasonable, allocable, and adequately documented with compensation supported by proper documentation as required by the CFR 200.403G and 200.430G. Time and effort reporting is required for all employees, not contractors, whose salaries are either fully or partially funded by federal sources or used to meet or match cost share requirements. This requirement applies to both full and part-time employees, as well as those receiving federal stipends. Note that if a contract is paid out of federal funds and it was a co-applicant, then they must be subject to time and effort requirement for staff working within that contract with the LEA. So to sum up, remember these 3 basics: the why, the who, and the how. Why time and effort? Time and effort is to ensure that there are adequate and consistent internal controls and that restricted federal programs are accurately charged. The who, as mentioned, is for any employees funded by federal grants, and they must maintain documentation showing that their time is allocable to a federal program. And finally, how is this done? Documentation of records that accurately reflect work performed. This is the evidence about the past, in form of kept in writing or some other permanent form. This is the official record that encompasses all activities that comply with established accounting policies and practices. So, what are the requirements for these time and effort reporting documents that satisfy a reflection of the accurate work performed? Well, records must, in accordance to CFR 200.43G, 430G, be supported by a system of internal controls which provides reasonable assurance that charges are accurate and allowable and properly allocated, be incorporated into the LEA's official records, reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated, not exceeding the 100% of the compensated activities, encompass both federally assisted and all other activities for which the employee is compensated, comply with established accounting policies and practices of the LEA and those procedures found in the CSAM, and support distribution of salary among specific activities or cost objectives if the employee works on one or more federal awards, a federal and non-federal award, or an indirect or direct cost activity. And now, Anita will go more in depth with the documentation involved in time and effort reporting. Take it away.
Thank you, Helen. So how can you ensure that your LEA has put into practice and systematized all that has been shared about time and effort reporting thus far? So let's begin by building a common understanding between a job description and a duty statement. Although not required by law, it is a best practice to create a duty statement for any employee who is paid from a federal grant or any state-restricted fund that requires time and effort reporting. Often the duty statement is confused with a job description, and although these may appear to be similar, they have some distinguishable differences. To begin, a job description provides general responsibilities of the position. The scope is broad, and it gives an overall summary of the role. And often it's the Human Resources Department who will develop a job description. On the other hand, a duty statement is more specific. It itemizes and describes the tasks, the functions, and responsibilities of a position, and it outlines what the employee will do daily or periodically. The duty statement helps the staff member understand how their work contributes to the overall mission of the federal grant. Duty statements also serve as an excellent source of evidence for when any program is FPM'd in your LEA. Duty statements are often developed by the administrative personnel responsible for the coordination and implementation of federal grants and those assurances. So on this slide, we provided you with a sample of what a job description for an instructional assistant would look like compared to a duty statement. At a glance, you can see that the job description includes logistical details, such as who the supervisor will be, the number of hours that will be worked, and a general description of the position. On the other hand, the duty statement we see in the red box provides very specific details about what will be expected of the staff member with much greater detail. Having a duty statement certainly has its benefits. A well-written and meaningful duty statement serves as a personnel management tool for both the employer and the employee. It helps staff understand their responsibilities and how their work contributes to the overall mission of the grant within the LEA. It can also serve as a useful tool for training purposes because it lists the specific tasks that make up the job, and it promotes understanding between the employer and the prospective employee of job performance and expectations. Once you have a detailed duty statement for positions that will carry out the work of the federal grant, you're ready for the next decision you'll need to make when it comes to time and effort reporting. So the next step is defining and understanding what is a cost objective, as defined by the Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, Part 200.1. A cost objective is a program, a function, activity, award, organizational subdivision, a contract, or work unit for which cost data are desired. Cost data is factual information concerning the cost of labor, material, overhead, and other cost elements which are expected to be incurred by a contractor in performing or carrying out the contract. In our case, these costs are those incurred by the LEA carrying out the intent of a federal grant awarded through the consolidated application. In practical terms, a cost objective is a set of work activities allowable under the terms and conditions of a particular funding source serving a specific population. So now let's connect what we learned about the responsibilities of a position outlined in a duty statement to a cost objective. There are two types of cost objectives, a single cost objective and a multiple cost objective. When trying to understand these terms, it helped me to think more about the term objective rather than the term cost. A single cost objective is a set of work activities where both the services being performed and the populations being served are allowable under each of the programs and grants supporting the cost objective. The position or activity worked is dedicated to a singular purpose, a singular objective. If this criteria is met, this set of work activities of a staff member is considered a single cost objective, even though it may be funded from more than one award. The multiple cost objective is when an employee works on more than one award and the activities performed may not be considered a single cost objective. The purpose of the objectives in the task is varied. It can also be a multiple cost objective when the employee works on multiple federal awards, a federal award and a non-federal award, or a direct or indirect activity. It can also be when a staff serves different student populations funded by different programs or grants. So let's look at some examples of a single cost objective focusing on the word or on the term objective. You have an instructional coach or a paraprofessional who is funded with Title I funds. Because these employees work on one type of activity or purpose, supporting eligible students in core content academic areas, and they are funded by one grant, their work is considered to be a single cost objective. In the case of an instructional coach who is funded by two different grants, but all of the tasks performed by the instructional coach in that role are allocable to both grants, then it is considered to be a single cost objective as well. A cafeteria cook has a singular objective to prepare meals for students that meet guidelines and are nutritious. Although the cook may be funded from several grants or awards, because the tasks and activities are allocable to each of the funds, They too are working under a single cost objective, a singular purpose. A multiple cost objective is when the objective of the work is varied, where all tasks are not all allocable to an award or perhaps all funding sources. It is when the employee works on more than one award and the activities performed may not be considered a single cost objective. In this example, a teacher on special assignment plans family workshops, supports new teachers, translates family documents, plans and organizes the DLAC meetings. All of these activities may not be allocable under each of the various federal grants. And it is possible that some of these tasks are allocable under a couple of the grants, but not all of them. For example, the tasks related to planning DLAC meetings may be allocable under LCFF, but not Title I or Title II. Planning family workshops might be allocable under LCFF and Title I, but perhaps not Title II, or not Title II. Supporting new teachers may be allocable under LCFF, Title I, and Title II. Nevertheless, because all of the tasks are not allocable under all of the grants, this person's time and effort is reported under multiple cost objectives. A word to the wise: if ever you are in doubt if activities or tasks in a person's duty statement serves a single cost objective or multiple cost objective, it is more prudent to report that person's time and effort under a multiple cost objective. Now, another document that is required for time and effort reporting is a position control report. A PCR, sometimes people call it a position control document, a PCD, ensures that the allocated funds from the grant are used appropriately to hire and maintain a designated workforce for the grant. This prevents overspending on personnel costs and demonstrates clear accountability to the Department of Ed and CDE. The PCD must include the employee's full name, the position title in its entirety, location of position or department, the funding source or sources if more than one, the percentage of each funding source as applicable, hours of the position or full-time equivalency, FTE, and if the position is funded using Title I funds, you must indicate the 85-15% rule and allowable reservations. Now, once the position control document or report is in place for the position funded by a federal award, whether in part or whole, you are ready to set the additional documents in motion. So now for the certifications. The type of documentation required for certification of time and effort is determined by the cost objective of the position. Employees who work solely on a single federal award or a single cost objective need only complete a periodic semi-annual certification. And the periodic certification must be prepared at least semi-annually or twice a year, be signed by the employee or the supervisor officially having firsthand knowledge of the work performed, and state that the employee works solely on the single federal program or single cost objective during the period covered by the certification. Employees who work on multiple activities or multiple cost objective of which at least one funding source requires time and effort accounting must complete a personnel activity report or equivalent documentation. PARS, or equivalent documentation, must reflect an after-the-fact distribution of the actual activity of each employee, account for the total activity for which each employee is compensated, and be prepared at least monthly and coincide with one or more pay periods and be signed by the employee. Now, thinking back to the instructional coach and the cook whose tasks were deemed a single cost objective, they would use a semi-annual certification document. A sample of that certification is showed on this slide and is also included in CSAM Procedure 905. That's the California School Accountability Manual. Now, remember that semi-annual certifications, it must be after the fact account for the total activity, and be signed by the employee or supervisor with first-hand knowledge of services performed and done every 6 months or at least twice a year. Now, please note that neither federal regulations nor the CDE require LEAs to use a specific format for documenting salaries and wages. As long as the format satisfies the requirements listed on this slide and in the CFRs, any document will suffice. However, semi-annual certifications and PARs are a good choice to use because you can rest assured that they contain all the required information that will be requested by you from your FPM reviewer. Now, another certification worth mentioning is a blanket semi-annual certification. If supervisors has firsthand knowledge of work performed by several employees on the same activity, a single certification may be used for all of those employees. A single certification or a blanket certification must include the listing of all the employees, the cost objective worked in accordance with a duty statement, and the time period covered. Again, this single record would be signed by the supervisor or a supervisory official having firsthand knowledge of the work performed by the employees. So an example of this might be a state-funded teacher who attended a professional, or many state-funded teachers who attended a professional development series after contract hours and received a stipend from Title II funds. The names of all, say, 20 teachers with all other required information such as the activity description, dates, and the time period, and the supervisor's signature would be included on a blanket periodic certification. Now, for an employee that has multiple cost objectives, CDE has shared this sample of a personnel activity report. The person's daily activities are detailed by time and funding sources for each day in the month. For personnel activity reporting, it must be after the fact, once the work has been performed, account for 100% of the employee's activity, be signed by the employee, and prepared at least monthly and coincide with one or more pay periods. Now, this report can be quite tedious and time-consuming for employees, and that is why it's important to create a system that will assist the staff member to complete the part with ease. Perhaps ensuring that the employee has the document prior to the start of the month or pay period would be beneficial so that the employee can account for their day at the end of each day. Also, encouraging the employee to keep a calendar of tasks worked on a daily basis will support them in completing this document accurately. So now that employees have provided services that are allowable, allocable, and necessary to the federal award, and the time accounting records have been completed, collected, and checked for accuracy, and they're up to code, things are looking good. And now the time has come to reconcile reports and cost allocations. You may find that although your best estimates of how much time an employee would spend on certain activities were well thought out and planned, the actual time accounting may be different than originally estimated. Perhaps the employee spent more time working on tasks allocable under one federal grant over another fund, and that's okay, it happens. But does your LEA reconcile budgeted distributions with the actual cost based on the time accounting reports submitted by verifying that the amounts and categories of the expenses match the entries in the general ledger with your business department? This process is important to follow and ensure accuracy. Budget estimates alone or other distribution percentages determined before services are performed do not qualify as support for charges to a federal fund. In other words, after the employee has completed time and effort reporting, you must true it up throughout the year. Your budget estimates at the beginning of the year versus your actual services performed by the end of the year may be different. And the process of estimating the budget and checking in on what actually is expended is a continuous process and required. So how does your system look for accuracy? Who reviews each time and effort report? Who trains the staff on how to complete it accurately? And what are your written policies and procedures that address reconciliation? So let's look at the reconciliation process requirement for time and effort. First, the LEA's system for establishing the estimate produces reasonable approximations of the activities actually performed. The closer you get, the better. But make sure to make time periodically to compare budgeted distributions with actual costs based on the monthly activity report. A best practice is to do this at least quarterly. If the variance between total budgeted and total actual costs are 10% or more, adjustments must be made at least quarterly to the LEA's financial records. But if the variances are less than 10%, the adjustments may be recorded annually. All necessary adjustments must be made such that the final amount charged to the federal award is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. Your internal control system must include a process for the after-the-fact review of reports. Now, I know we've gone over quite a bit with time and effort, and I know that we have some questions in the chat, but right now, Helen is going to close out this section with a summary and some additional reminders. Helen?
Thank you, Anita. So in summary, the bottom line for time and effort reporting can be summarized in the following major points. Any employees paid with any amount of federal funds or required from a state program must keep accurate records to support time and effort benefiting the federal or restricted state program. The LEA must have written procedures in place describing how this will take place in the LEA. Where are the forms found? When are they completed? When are they submitted? To whom and who checks them? And all employees paid from more than one source and cost objective require more detailed reporting. And the difference between actual time reported and budgeted amounts must be reconciled so the work and the report match up as closely as possible. And remember that because this involves salaries and benefits, and compliance findings for time and effort can result in significant payback of the funds. And speaking of paying back, the lack of time and effort reporting is one of the largest audit findings by the U.S. Office of Inspector General, or OIG. Remember that costs that do not have adequate documentation are deemed unallowable and subject to repayment. Listed here are some common issues that can affect compliance and reporting accuracy. Unclear duty statements, which can lead to confusion about how employees should charge certain activities. Employees charging non-allocable activities to federal programs. Employees reporting their budgeted hours instead of the actual hours worked. And LEAs not following their own established policies and procedures, and LEAs lacking a reconciliation process for proper record keeping and validation. And you will also see that time and effort documents are required in the FPM instruments such as CE 12, 15, Fiscal Monitoring 1 and 6, and Expanded Learning 9. So, as we end this section, I have a question for something to think about. Put it in the chat. Can electronic signatures be used to approve time and effort? What do you think? Place your answer in the chat. Okay, I see some yeses. And yes, thank you. Yes. However, this must be accounted for in the policies and procedures and provided for internal controls. Provide internal controls. An example of an internal control for digital signatures, only using certified signatures. Okay. Okay. And our last question, place your answer in the chat. If a position has a single cost objective, which documentation is most appropriate? Place your answer in the chat. Awesome. Thank you. Next slide. Yes, that's right. All of you have indicated A, for single cost objective position, semi-annual certification would be most appropriate. And keep in mind that time and effort documentation is required for any employees funded by what? Federal grants, and it must show that their time is allocable to the program. This documentation must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed, which is the cost objective. Now, I'll turn it over to Rachel for maintenance of effort. Take it away.
Thank you, Helen, and good morning, everyone. So in this next section, as Helen mentioned, we're going to be covering maintenance of effort. So maintenance of effort is a district level determination that's made annually by the CDE at the end of the fiscal year. It applies to multiple federal programs, but it's somewhat differently depending on the program. And so the purpose is to ensure that states and districts maintain the level of fiscal effort in supporting education programs from year to year and not lower the local or state level of support as a result of receiving federal funds. So for ESSA programs, the state agency must demonstrate that either the combined fiscal effort per student or the aggregate expenditures of the LEA from state and local funds in the preceding year was not less than 90% of that for the second preceding fiscal year. And if the LEA fails to meet that minimum level in a given fiscal year, and for one or more of the 5 immediately preceding fiscal years, then all ESSA program funds must be reduced in the same proportion to which the LEA failed to meet that 90% requirement. The maintenance of effort calculations include expenditures from state and local funds for public education, and that includes administration, instruction, attendance and health services, student transportation services, operation and maintenance of plant, fixed charges, and net expenditures to cover deficits for food services and student body activities. Expenditures that are excluded from the calculations are those for community services, capital outlay, debt service, supplemental expenses as a result of a presidentially declared disaster, and expenditures from federal funds. In the next few slides, we've included a few examples of the maintenance of effort calculations. And so again, there are 2 ways to calculate maintenance of effort, either the combined fiscal effort per student or the aggregate expenditures of the LEA. And so the examples show both calculation options using fiscal years 2021-22 and 2022-23 as the comparison years. So in this first example, the LEA needed to spend $5,490 on a per student basis or $900,000 in the aggregate to meet the 90% level. And so you can see that the LEA exceeded those amounts per student and in the aggregate. So in this example, maintenance of effort was met. In this next example, we see that maintenance of effort was also met. And again, the LEA needed to spend $5,490 per student or $900,000 in the aggregate during fiscal year 2022-23. Here we see that the LEA met the 90% level on a per student basis, and therefore maintenance of effort was considered met because the LEA only needs to meet it one of the 2 ways. In this last example, again, the LEA needed to spend $5,490 per student during fiscal year 2022-23 to meet the 90% level, but only spent $5,200 per student. That means the LEA failed to maintain effort by $290 or 5.3% on a per student basis. At the aggregate level, the LEA needed to spend $900,000 during the fiscal year 22-23 to meet that 90% level, but only spent $850,000. As a result, the LEA failed to maintain effort by $50,000 or 5.6%. And so the state will use the percentage that is the most advantageous to the LEA. So in this example, that would be the 5.3%. So if the LEA also failed to meet the maintenance of effort requirement for one or more of the 5 immediately preceding fiscal years, then the state must reduce the LEA's allocation by 5.3% for all ESSA programs. And one last important thing to note is that the Secretary of Education has the authority to waive the maintenance of effort requirements due to exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances or a precipitous decline in the LEA's financial resources. And so that concludes this section. So I will now turn it over to Debbie.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So we're going to talk about supplement, not supplant. And supplement, no, not supplant is also referred to as S&S. But before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to remind everyone why program or the instructional side of the organization is involved so deeply in the fiscal funding expenditures. While our fiscal departments have expertise in their fields, most do not have that instructional background to make determinations regarding the use of funds. They're not equipped to make the determination if expenditures are indeed supplemental. This foundation in instruction is critical to being able to appropriately utilize funds as they are intended. Therefore, program and fiscal teams need to work together to appropriately use and account for the organization's use of these funds. Okay, so supplement, not supplant. This is where we go back one, sorry. This is a phrase we hear very often when we talk about federal funds, because the idea, supplement, not supplant, is a condition of one or more of our funding sources. So pictured on this slide is guidance for the supplement, not supplant from the U.S. Department of Education. And the link to this publication is there at the bottom of the screen. Supplement, not supplant means that the state agency or local education agency uses the federal funds, specifically Title I Part A, to supplement state and local funds, not to supplant them. So moving next slide. We've used this simple explanation in the past, but it's fitting and easily demonstrates the concept of S&S. So we begin with this simple definition of the words supplement and supplant. Supplement is both a noun and a verb. As a noun, it's something that completes or enhances something else when we add to it. As a verb, this is the action of adding something extra or amount to it. Supplant is the verb meaning to supersede or to replace. So I've often heard this analogy throughout my career is with the ice cream. When you start with ice cream, you add to it, you add the sprinkles and the cherry and the whipped cream, that's supplementing. When you have a simple vanilla cone and you change it maybe to the next chocolate, that's really not adding to it. It's exchanging it for something else. That's supplanting. So it's a very simple concept, but demonstrates the idea. Next slide, please. There are some requirements when we talk about supplement, supplant, it's very specific. So the LEA needs to demonstrate that each Title I school is allocated all of their state and local funds that they would be entitled to without any regard to receiving Title I. So the LEA is going to demonstrate this through regular procedures for distribution of funds, that they would distribute those state and local funds without considering the school Title I funding or any other funding. Compliance is going to be determined by a methodology, not on expenditure or obligations of funds. And in order to demonstrate the compliance with the methodology, the LEA needs to ensure that the determination is met for both the school and the LEA level expenditures. Next slide. So In this simple graphic, we see that the yellow represents state and local funds. So this occurs before anything else. So the distribution on whatever methodology or criteria that is determined by the school district. Then the title funds are distributed to the appropriate schools that have been identified after you have done your ranking and serve process. And those are your Title I schools. And this includes your targeted assistance schools. Next slide. And next slide, there we go. So supplement, the methodology is referring to both the school level expenditures and the LEA. So at the school level, the LEA must be able to determine that the money was allocated before the consideration of Title I. And when you're talking about the LEA level, this also for those Title I funds that were held, that needs to be held back, and the state and local funds need to be distributed across, and then Title I money on top of that. Next slide. Here's an example for us. And we're going to look at two different examples. So this one, it's the determination of what methodology is being used. And it's up to the LA how to decide what they're going to do. And in this example, we see that in our first example, it's based on student characteristics. So this example allocates state and local funds to schools based on a standard formula through which an LEA allocates dollar amounts based on objective student characteristics. And in this example, there are varying per pupil allocations based on characteristics of students in each school. This includes a base allocation per student and additional funding per low income, English learner, students with disabilities, and preschool students. To meet the supplement, not supplant requirement for Title I, an LEA would use this methodology to allocate state and local funds to each school without consideration or regard to their Title I status. Next slide. Here we go. And here's the second example with a methodology based on personnel and non-personnel costs. In this example, we allocate state and local funds to schools based on average LEA-wide salaries for each category of school personnel, such as principals, librarians, school counselors, and teachers, and the average LEA-wide per pupil expenditure for non-personnel resources, such as instructional materials and supplies. Both of our examples demonstrate methodologies that would meet the SNS requirements, since each example is neutral to whether a school is Title I or not. Next slide, please. So you can see those two examples would demonstrate that the money was allocated to the schools without regard to being Title I or not. Next slide. Now, Title II, III, and IV do also have the supplement, not supplant provision. However, there is a different requirement for compliance. In general, federal funds may not be used to supplant non-federal funds that would otherwise be used for activities authorized under the program. It's important to note that Title III does have the highest threshold to meet the supplement, not supplant requirements, because it requires that the program funds not supplant not only state and local funds, but also other federal funds. Essentially, the supplanting analysis simply asks what would have happened in the absence of federal funds. If, in the absence of receiving any funding under a given federal program, the LEA would still have paid for it, such as textbooks or computers or salaries, then it would be a supplanting violation. You cannot use federal funds to pay for those expenditures. Federal funds are intended to provide something extra. Next slide. So for the most part, federal programs such as Title II, III, and IV, auditors presume that supplanting has occurred based on the test of 3. So here's the presumption. if they were used to provide services that were required to be made available under other federal, state, or local laws, had been provided with non-federal funds in the prior year, or had provided the same service to non-participating children using non-federal funds. The presumption can be rebutted in some cases, but if it makes any of these three, then the presumption of supplanting is made. And we don't want that to happen. Next slide, please. So supplement, not supplant, is part of the FPM process, a large part, and under the different titles. You can see here we have a sample of the different program instruments that do have the supplement, not supplant provision. And we wanted to make sure that you understood this as a basic overview, but there is a lens to this, and this is something that during FPM is really looked at. And so we want, if you have any questions, we ask you to please reach out and seek help from us, and that's what we're here for. And now back to Rachel for Title I comparability.
Thank you, Debbie. So next we have Title I comparability. And so LEAs receiving Title I Part A funds must demonstrate that all schools are providing comparable services using state and local funds. The purpose of this requirement is to ensure that LEAs provide at least the same amount of funding to schools receiving Title I funds as they do to non-Title I schools. Now, comparability calculations are completed annually at the district level and on a school-by-school basis. The calculations must also be done in a timely manner to ensure that all schools are in a comparable position and to allow the district to make any needed adjustments with the least amount of disruption in order to avoid the loss of Title I Part A funding. So to meet comparability requirements, LEAs must file a written assurance with the state. Also develop procedures for compliance with comparability requirements, and maintain records demonstrating that the calculations are conducted on an annual basis. When completing the calculations, LEAs must confirm that the student to full-time equivalent teacher ratios fall within a reasonable variance. And in California, this has been determined to be a 30% variance. So the written assurance that was just mentioned is filed with the state through the spring CONAP, when LEAs complete and submit the Certification of Assurances form. And through the certification of this form, LEAs are assuring that they have established and implemented a district-wide salary schedule, as well as policies to ensure equivalence among schools in staffing and in the provision of materials and supplies. And so here on the slide, you can see a screenshot of all of the legal assurances included in the spring CONAP, as well as a screenshot of the comparability assurances. So as mentioned, LEAs must develop written procedures for compliance with comparability requirements. And so these procedures should include the LEA's timeline and process for demonstrating comparability. Also, the office responsible for completing the calculations, and a description of how and when adjustments are made in schools that are not comparable. LEAs must also maintain source documentation to support the calculations, as well as any documentation related to any adjustments made to staffing to ensure comparability. And it's required that LEAs maintain this documentation for 3 years after the completion of the activity for which funds were used. However, we recommend maintaining documentation for 5 years. LEAs must use student enrollment to full-time equivalent teacher ratios to determine whether schools are comparable. And so the calculations can be done in one of 2 ways, either by comparing all schools within the LEA as a whole, or by comparing all schools within the LEA by each grade span group. And as previously mentioned, the student to full-time equivalent teacher ratios must fall within a 30% variance. And so if schools are not comparable, then the LEA must make adjustments to ensure that all schools are in a comparable position. And so completing these calculations early enough in the school year will allow the LEA to make any needed adjustments with the least amount of disruption. And so CDE recommends that the LEAs complete the calculations and make any necessary adjustments by October 31st of each year. So there are several exclusions that LEAs may use when determining comparability. And so first off, LEAs are not required to include any unpredictable changes that occur after the beginning of the school year, such as changes in student enrollment or personnel assignments. Schools with 200 or fewer students may also be excluded from the calculations. Also, if the LEA is a single school LEA or has only one school for each grade span group, then the comparability requirements do not apply. LEAs may also exclude state or local funds expended for language instruction programs and the excess cost of providing services to students with disabilities. And finally, LEAs may exclude state and local funds expended for programs that meet the intent and purposes of Title I, Part A. In addition to the exclusions that were just referenced on the previous slide, there are also several school types that are exempt from meeting comparability requirements. And so this includes alternative schools of choice, continuation high schools, county community schools, district community day schools, juvenile court schools, opportunity schools, public special education schools, and youth authority schools. So the CDE has developed calculation forms to assist LEAs in determining comparability. And so the forms are in Excel format, and they provide LEAs with immediate information on whether or not a school meets comparability through both of the options that were mentioned, so LEA-wide or by the grade span group. And so the calculation forms, as well as instructions and other related resources, are available on the CDE website, and we've included the link at the bottom of the slide for you. So when completing these forms, LEAs need to enter the school name, the school type, the grade span group code, student enrollment, and total full-time equivalent teachers for all schools included in the school student counts report in CARS. And so the last two columns will automatically populate based on the student enrollment and FTE teacher information that gets entered. And the last column will indicate whether or not the school is comparable. And so if you calculate comparability based on one method, such as the LEA-wide average, and you find that a school is not comparable, then it's recommended that you try the other option. So that would be the grade span group average. And then if after trying both options, a school is still not comparable, then that's when the LEA would need to make adjustments in staffing to meet the comparability requirements. And so one important thing to remember when completing these calculation forms is that the student enrollment data and the full-time equivalent teacher data must be captured on the same date for every school within the LEA. And so you'll want to maintain documentation that this data is captured on the same date. And then another important reminder is that the calculations should only include teachers whose salaries are paid using state and local funds. And so if you have teachers who are split funded, then you would calculate the FTE using only the percentage of their salary that's paid with state or local funds. So here's an example of a completed comparability form based on the LEA-wide average. In this example, you can see in the last column that middle school A is not comparable. So in this case, you would try the other option, which is the grade span group average. And so as mentioned, the calculation forms are in Excel format. And so once you enter the information in the LEA-wide average tab, it will auto-populate that same data for each school into the grade span group tabs. So you won't have to enter the information again. Another thing you can see in this example is that 2 schools are exempt as indicated in the last column. So elementary school C is exempt because it has less than 200 students. And high school B is exempt because it is a continuation school. And so the forms will auto-populate the last column with exempt if the school has 200 or fewer students, or if it meets one of the school type exemptions. So here we see another example, and this one is based on the grade span group average, with the same elementary and middle school data that was included on the previous slide. And so the first screenshot shows the elementary grade span group, and the second shows the middle school grade span group. And so you can see that by using the grade span group average calculation, middle school A is now comparable. And so in this example, it worked out for middle school A using the grade span group option. However, if after trying both options, a school is still not comparable, then that's when the LEA would need to make adjustments in order to meet comparability requirements. So here we've included a sample timeline for determining comparability. And so this sample is based on a CDE sample timeline that can be accessed at the link provided. And so it's important for LEAs to establish a timeline to determine comparability. And so early determination of comparability, again, it allows the LEA to make adjustments with the least amount of disruption. And again, it's recommended that the calculations and any needed adjustments are completed by October 31st of each year. So here we just have a few reminders. And so as a reminder, the comparability requirements are monitored through the FPM process in the compensatory education instrument, specifically item 14. And so evidence requests for this item include the completed LEA comparability of services calculation forms, the current district-wide salary schedule, the LEA's policy to ensure equivalence among schools in teachers, administrators, and other staff, and the LEA's policy to ensure equivalence among schools in the provision of materials and supplies. And so if your LEA receives Title I Part A funds, be sure to verify that your LEA has these required policies and procedures in place and is also annually completing the required calculations and making any needed adjustments. Okay, so before closing out this section, let's do a quick check for understanding. So student enrollment data and FTE teacher data must be captured on the same date for all schools in the LEA. Is this true or false? Put your answer in the chat. Yes, it is true. Both pieces of data must be captured on the same date for all schools. And so that concludes this section. So I will now turn it over to Jeannie for equipment inventory.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. This morning, we'll take a look at key requirements addressing expenditures for equipment using federal funds. So on this slide is item 16 from the Compensatory Education Program instrument used for federal program monitoring. CE 16 requires that the LEA spending Title I Part A funding on equipment shall maintain a historical inventory record for each piece of equipment with an acquisition cost of $500 or more per unit. So evidence of an equipment inventory is required as part of multiple programs, including Title I, Title III, Federal Stimulus Monitoring Program instruments, just to name a few. And a note to point out here is the word historical, which means the inventory record must contain the history of the equipment inventory. So it's ongoing, showing the useful life of the equipment. And you can see here the CE item lists all the components with letters A through M that an equipment inventory must include. And among these components are, of course, the model name and serial and identification number of the item, the funding source, who holds the title, the percentage of federal participation in the project costs for the federal award under which the property was acquired, as well as any ultimate disposition data, including the date of disposal or removal, or the sale price or method used to determine current market value. On this next slide, we take a moment to talk about equipment control. And maintaining control of your equipment starts with tracking and labeling equipment items. Within your equipment control system, all equipment that is purchased with federal funds needs to be inventoried and labeled with purchasing information. LEAs must also ensure that there are procedures to guard against loss of equipment and materials. This screenshot offers a sample label indicating LEA's name, school name, program it was purchased from, purchase date, delivery date, serial number, and salvage date. Here, we wanted to bring to your attention that while the FPM instrument applies to all non-consumable equipment and supplies that must be accounted for if they exceed $500 in value and have a useful life of 1 or more years, an additional aspect to your equipment inventory system that is important is how items that are less than $500 are tracked and accounted for. Some of these items may be items such as computing devices that are defined in the Uniform Grant Guidance, as well as small equipment items that are less than $500. For these smaller items of lesser cost that could easily go missing, what is your policy and procedure to monitor these items that could easily walk away? How does your LEA account for small and attractive new technology that may cost less than $500? What is your system to prevent theft and loss of these items? A suggestion you may want to consider is to include these on an inventory list as well. And you may have a separate inventory to account for these items that also may be part of your system to prevent theft and loss. So continuing with equipment control, Code of Federal Regulations 200.313 addresses responsibilities for recipients and subrecipients of federal program grants to manage equipment that is acquired in part or fully with federal funds. A control system must be in place to ensure safeguards for preventing property loss, damage, or theft. Any loss, damage, or theft of equipment must be investigated. And so the recipient must notify the federal agency or pass-through entity of any loss, damage, or theft that will have an impact on the program. And additionally, regular maintenance procedures must be in place to ensure that your property is in proper working conditions. And so our slide offers questions for the LEA when developing and reflecting on their system of internal controls to support management of equipment for their programs. We've also included requirements that apply to any equipment that is being used for the district program that is providing equitable services for eligible students at private schools. The inventory of any equipment in use at the private schools for the district program is maintained on the district inventory tracking system, and the tracking labels include the district name. Additionally, remember the equipment and supplies purchased with federal funds for equitable services belong to the district, not to the private school. Next slide, please. Thank you. We will take a look now at compensatory education instrument item number 16.1. This addresses capital expenditures which have been defined as any single item equipment for purchase of $5,000 or more. You'll note that beginning October 1st, 2024, the threshold amount increased to $10,000. So for the current FPM instrument, looking back at expenditures, the purchase for equipment using Title I Part A funds that exceed the $5,000 unit cost must meet all the requirements included on the slide. And these components must be addressed in a written request to CDE for approval prior to making the purchase. The link to the pre-approval capital outlay request form is included for your reference on the slide. The LEA needs to ensure all required components apply to the purchase request. Specifically, the item must directly relate to a Title I Part A purpose and program approved for assistance with specific Title I funds in the LEA's local plan. LEAs or county offices need to provide a supporting quote or bid for each capital outlay request form that is submitted to the CDE for approval. And the purchase must be intended to improve, enhance, or expand the Title I eligible program to be funded. And of course, the purchase must be necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient administration of the Title I eligible program. And the equipment must be specific. In other words, allocable to the eligible Title I programs, as opposed to a general expense required to carry out the LEA's overall responsibilities. We will look at another item related to equipment purchased with Title I funds. CE 16.2 addresses the disposition or removal of the equipment on the LEA's inventory list. When equipment acquired under a federal award is no longer needed for the original project, program, or for other activities supported by the federal agency, the recipient or subrecipient must request for disposition from the federal agency, in this case, the CDE, and for specifically disposition of equipment purchased with Title I Part A funds with a fair market value in excess of $5,000, the item may be retained by the LEA or sold at a percentage of the current market value, and in this case, the proceeds go to the CDE. CDE requires LEAs to complete the Title I equipment removal form linked on the slide. And for any items lost, stolen, or missing, the LEA must also report on the circumstances that resulted in this issue. And so once LEAs receive confirmation for completing and submitting the equipment removal form, they can then document on their historical inventory form the date and reason for the removal of the equipment. So the last component related to equipment inventory for the Title I program that we will look at is CE 16.3. For this item, the LEA must conduct a physical inventory of the property, and the results must be reconciled with the property records at least every 2 years. This is addressed in Uniform Grant Guidance under Management Requirements for Equipment for Federal Awards. Additionally, 2 reminders are noted per this guidance. These include that a control system must be in place to ensure those safeguards for preventing property loss, damage, or theft, and any loss, damage, or theft must be investigated. The recipient or subrecipient must also notify the federal agency of any of these items that have an impact on the program. And we saw this addressed in the equipment disposal form. Additionally, regular maintenance procedures must be in place to ensure the property is in proper working condition. And to summarize this section, our slide offers some key points discussed this morning regarding keeping track of equipment inventory and maintaining control of equipment allocable to federal programs. These include maintaining a historical inventory of all equipment with a unit price over $500, inclusive of district-owned equipment being used at private schools for equitable services, and keeping inventory copies at the district office and in the school offices. And additionally, conducting and reconciling physical inventory of your equipment at least every 2 years, and maintaining a control system to prevent loss, damage, or theft. So now we'll finish up our section on equipment with a quiz. Take a moment to read the question as I share it with you. To track control of equipment, an LEA must A, maintain a historical inventory of all equipment purchased for more than $500 per unit. B, maintain equipment inventory only at Title I schools. C, include 13 specific items for each inventoried item. And D, conduct a physical inventory of equipment at least every 2 years and reconcile physical inventory to the LEA inventory list. And E is answers A, C, and D. So put your answers in the chat. And it looks like, thank you, many of you are correct. The answer is E. B does not apply because the equipment inventory applies at all schools, not just at your Title I schools. Next up in our program, Laurel's going to provide a closer look at the federal program monitoring process.
Thank you, Jeannie. So as we wrap up these 2 days, remember on day 1, we said there are many strings attached to the money. Well, over the past 2 workshop days, we've talked about these strings and shared the rules and requirements of federal programs. These rules are in place to make sure there is no waste, fraud, or abuse. The monitoring process is a way that the state and federal government ensures that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse. In day 1, we shared this slide. It provides information about how fiscal monitoring is accomplished. We're going to take a closer look at the ways in which fiscal compliance is monitored through the Federal Program Monitoring, or FPM, process. In order to understand the FPM process, it's important to know the purpose of the funding. This is the state and federal funding graphic we shared on day 1 of this workshop. We have added Ed Relief, ELOP, and LREBG funds to this graphic. These funds are outside of the state's LCFF funds and the federal program funds. This is because the use of these funds differs and in some cases can be broader than most federal categorical funds, but still requires adherence to federal requirements. Part of the FPM process requires evidence that there is fiscal compliance. In this slide, we have provided 2 of the instruments that are used to monitor fiscal compliance in an FPM review. Fiscal monitoring addresses primarily the title programs. Federal stimulus monitoring, abbreviated as CA, monitors the ed relief funds that were provided in response to the pandemic. You can see that there is overlap between the items reviewed. We have covered these topics throughout our two presentations. The fiscal side of the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program is also included in the FPM. 2023-24 school year was the first year that ELOP was included in the FPM. It is important to note that there are two FPM instruments that pertain to the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, or ELOP. The EXLP instrument monitors the program components. The ELOP instrument monitors that financial resources are used to support program objectives, compliance with funding regulations, and accountability of funds. Again, the items monitored are also reviewed in the fiscal monitoring and federal stimulus monitoring instruments. This is a list of the most frequently non-compliant items from last year's 23-24 FPM reviews of the federal stimulus monitoring instrument. Overall, there was a decrease of LEA findings compared to the previous year. Procurement has the highest frequency of LEA findings in CA04. It was also the highest frequency of findings for ELOP04. In upcoming slides, we will provide some resources to support procurement processes and procedures. You can find all the FPM resources for federal stimulus monitoring and all other programs in CDE's box. The link is provided for you on this slide. CA04 and ELOP04 pertain to procurement. There are many components to procurement, which could be why it is the highest item of noncompliance for both federal stimulus monitoring and ELOP. The LEA must follow the appropriate procurement processes for all contracts. In addition, the LEA must have and use documented procurement procedures. Key points are included in this slide. Specific guidance regarding procurement is provided in the CSAM, and a link is included in this slide. CDE provides a yearly state and federal procurement flowchart to help understand this process. We have provided the 2024 procurement flowchart and the CDE procurement table as handouts linked to this slide. When it comes to procurement, it's important for program and fiscal staff to work together to ensure compliance using CDE and federal guidance. As part of procurement, LEAs must establish conflict of interest policies and disclose in writing any potential conflict to the federal awarding agency. A conflict of interest arises when any of the individuals listed here has a financial or other interest in the firm selected for the award. Please note that board member is in red because this was recently specified in the updated Code of Federal Regulations. It is important to ensure that the policy includes disciplinary language to address violations to the policy, as this is a common finding for the conflict of interest policy in both CA04 and ELOP04. As we conclude the two-day fiscal workshop, we want to circle back to what we said at the beginning of day one. Implementing your federal programs must be a team effort. Fiscal staff play an important role by completing tasks such as processing payments, tracking and reporting expenditures. Program staff determine allowability, make sure that expenses are charged to the correct program accounts, and ensure that timelines are followed, to name just a few responsibilities. This is all to minimize any risks of the LEA not meeting their oversight responsibilities of public funds. Please take time to provide us with any feedback by using either the link or the QR code. We do review the feedback and will use it to guide future planning. We will leave the chat open in case you have additional questions. And on behalf of the team, thank you so much for attending today's session. And we hope that the information provided is helpful. Have a great afternoon.